again. As a member of the Bobolink Roundtable, I have to agree with absolutely everything that Betty Jean said. It's been a really good experience for me to be able to work with people, all the people that are part of that roundtable. Anyway, is my thing up? Not quite. Since I'm in the last session of the day, I thought I'd give your eyes a bit of a break and just show you beautiful pictures of endangered species while I'm giving my presentation. It's probably no secret that Ontario Nature and actually lots of other environmental organizations in the province are deeply concerned about MNR's proposal to create a whole new set of exemptions to the Endangered Species Act. And I do call them exemptions because that's exactly what they are. They're exceptions to the rules, the two fundamental rules: you can't harm a species and you can't damage or destroy its habitat. So I call them exceptions because I like to be clear about what I'm talking about. We've been vocal about especially the industry-wide exemptions, the exemptions for forestry, aggregates, hydro, renewable energy, waste management, and more, infrastructure and more. But there's another set of exemptions which tie into my topic for this afternoon, which is safe harbor. There's an exemption. Safe harbor is also proposed for an exemption to go through with an exemption. And it's one of a whole set of exemptions that we haven't talked about a lot. Ontario Nature hasn't talked about a lot publicly, though we've talked about it in our comments to government. But we don't talk about it a lot publicly because it's complicated. It's difficult to explain, and unless people have lots of background knowledge and lots of patience to go into details, you just don't get what we're worried about. And I can fully appreciate that at the end of the day and the last day of a conference, you probably don't have a lot of patience either to hear about this. But I hope you will bear with me for the next 15 minutes or so as I try to explain what I think is at stake. So this set of exemptions that I'm talking about, of which safe harbor is a part, may seem okay on the surface, but if you dig a little deeper, I think there is reason for concern, and it's primarily because all exemptions, any exemption, is about getting around the fundamental protections that are offered under the Act, which is you can't harm a species or you can't damage or destroy its habitat. And in some cases, in terms of this second set of exemptions, in some cases, I think that the standard of protection will be lowered. That is, the standard of overall benefit will no longer be part of the scheme. But in pretty much all cases, what has me really worried is the dramatic reduction in the government's role in overseeing activities that harm a species or damage or destroy its habitat. And I think this reduction in government involvement is a bad idea. It's not a desirable outcome, but as I said, it's pretty complicated. So my challenge here today is, on one hand, to highlight the amazing potential of safe harbor, and at the very same time, to sound the alarm bell about having safe harbor go through under an exemption. So I feel like I'm going to have to play the role of the witch, which I'm not too happy about, but essentially I have to be critical and cranky about what I think is fundamentally a great thing. And so that's where I'm sitting. I'll begin with an explanation, a quick explanation of what safe harbor is, because I think there might be a few people in the audience who aren't very clear. And then I'll provide some background about how this idea has been evolving in Ontario. To begin, safe harbor is a stewardship mechanism. It's not, I forget what the word was this morning, it's not the silver bullet. It is one mechanism that will encourage stewardship, and that's what its intention is. It comes to us from the United States, where it was first implemented in 1995. And in the United States, it involves a landowner and a government agency coming together under a binding stewardship agreement. That's how it is implemented in the States. Safe harbor agreements are voluntary and they're time limited. No one has to get involved. It's by choice to get involved. Safe harbor ensures that if you decide to do a stewardship initiative, at the end of the day, you can undo it. So you can build a wetland, and at the end of the agreement, you can take it out. even if a Blanding's turtle moves into your wetland, even if a least bittern moves into your wetland, it doesn't matter. You can take it out, and you will not be, you won't be breaking the law. You won't be contravening the ESA. So Safe Harbor allows what's called incidental take, so it's harm to a species, and it allows habitat to be damaged or destroyed at the end of the agreement. But there's a limit to that. You can only undo what you've done to the point of where you started. So you can return to baseline, you can return to where you originally started, but you can't go lower than that under a Safe Harbor agreement. The basic assumption or presumption behind the concept of Safe Harbor is that landowners want to do the right thing. There's a strong stewardship ethic, and we need to be able to work with landowners to encourage it, foster it, and let it go. But to do that, it's best if you can assure a landowner that the hammer of the law is not going to come down on his or her head at the end of the day. And so that's what Safe Harbor agreements are intended to do. They deal with a justifiable concern of the landowner about what might happen, what bad things might happen if they do good things for endangered species or other wildlife. Because you never know what lies ahead. Today, you might be quite willing to build a wetland, but 10 years from now, circumstances change and you might need to take it out, and that's what Safe Harbor allows. There was a great question this morning about sort of the long-term implications of going down the Safe Harbor road, and I think it was a really great question. But what we're seeing in the United States is something very positive, and I forget who responded to it, but whoever it was, it may have been Ron, but whoever responded to it said that in the United States, what we're seeing is that people don't want to undo their good things. Once they enter into Safe Harbor agreements, it seems to be that people just want to keep what they've put into the ground. And so I think the long-term hope with Safe Harbor is actually a change in mindset. And again, there's research in the States that shows that mindset change is happening. There's a shift. Landowners that are involved in Safe Harbor, they don't feel the same way about endangered species anymore. They're not so afraid of them. They're not so worried about them. They don't see them as such a liability as they used to. And that's where the sort of the future of Safe Harbor lies, I think. So in the United States, Safe Harbor seems to be working. So let's switch the context to Ontario. Before the ESA was created in 2007, the government at the time established an advisory panel of expert, legal, and scientific people. And they asked this panel to give them advice on how to create the best endangered species legislation possible. So, looking to the American experience, this panel strongly recommended to the government that it enable Safe Harbor through its Endangered Species Act. And that's something that hadn't happened in the States. They came to it in the States after the fact, but the advice from the States was, do it as you're creating the legislation, and so that's what was done. The government listened, and they put in what's called Section 16 under the Endangered Species Act, and that Section 16 allows the government to enter into these agreements with landowners around restoration and creation of habitat, and at the same time it allows, as part of that agreement, it allows the landowner to violate the prohibitions. In other words, to contravene those protections. You can't harm a species and you can't damage or destroy its habitat. So that's all set up in the ESA. It was foreseen from the outset. So although Safe Harbor hasn't been tried in Ontario yet, there's a lot of interest and momentum. Ontario Nature's been aware of the potential of Safe Harbor for a long time, and a couple of years ago we set up, I think it was 4 or 5 workshops across southern Ontario to speak with farmers and naturalists and some other people about the Safe Harbor concept to sort of test it out. And across the board, widespread support for this idea, some concerns, lots of questions, but basically people seem to believe that if we could do Safe Harbor, we could really encourage a lot of good stewardship in Ontario. So coming out of those workshops, a bunch of the organizations involved, and there were 15 of us in all, we wrote a letter to the minister at the time, Linda Jeffrey, and said, we think you should pilot Safe Harbour in Ontario. Would you consider it, please? That was almost 2 years ago, and in my own way, I've been working on advocating for Safe Harbour ever since. I've had lots of productive conversations with M&R. They've been doing some great work behind the scenes, just looking at the issues, looking at the questions, trying to figure out how it should be done, as well as with conversations with lots of stakeholders, including people on the Bobolink Roundtable. So we're ready. We're ready in terms of the Bobolink Roundtable to see this go forward, and it's been part of our recommendations to the minister. It's because we see it as actually quite closely, it's something that needs to be part of the Species at Risk Benefit Exchange that we talked about this morning, that SARBEX thing. We think that Safe Harbour needs to be integrated into the bigger SARBEX scheme. Because if a landowner is going to, through SARBEX, is going to create or manage habitat for species at risk, at the end of the day, that landowner might want to be covered by Safe Harbour. They might want to know that when that SARBEX agreement comes to an end, they can actually get out of their Safe Harbour, or they can actually get out of it and not be penalized because they've brought a bobolink and meadowlark onto their properties. So we see it as a way to ensure that the landowner retains control over their land and their property going forward, and that's what Safe Harbour would allow. So it had felt to me up until late last winter or late last fall, it had felt to me like we were kind of seeing eye to eye on this. And then M&R announced that it wanted to implement Safe Harbour through an exemption. So perhaps you can imagine my dismay at the idea that this thing, Safe Harbour, that I've been such a strong advocate for, was suddenly going to be put through under an exemption. Or maybe you can't imagine my dismay because it actually doesn't seem like such a bad thing to most people. And I'm sure that's the case for many people on the Bobolink Roundtable. So all I can say is I was pretty flabbergasted when that proposal came forward, in part because M&R had been, up until then, proceeding so slowly and so carefully and so cautiously about Safe Harbour. I mean, we're 6 years into the Endangered Species Act and we still haven't got it on the ground yet, and all of a sudden it seemed like caution was being thrown to the wind. It's a brand new idea in the sense that it's never been tested in Ontario, and it's only been implemented through very detailed legal agreements in the United States. And suddenly, M&R seems to want to throw the gates wide open through an exemption. So it makes me very, very nervous. What is my problem? What's wrong with doing Safe Harbour through an exemption? Here's what I can say. First of all, I think that creating or managing habitat for an endangered species is not an easy thing. It's not exactly something that most landowners are familiar with. Even managing hayfields for bobolink, something that farmers are familiar with, it's not that straightforward when your goal is to recover an endangered species like bobolink or meadowlark. There are lots of questions. And, multiply that by the fact that for other species that we haven't even been thinking about along these terms, it can get quite complicated. There are lots of species and there are lots of actions that people could take, and all of a sudden, if Safe Harbour can go through under an exemption, what's that going to mean? I think that Safe Harbour simply doesn't lend itself to approach based on setting down a few conditions under a regulation. I don't think it lends itself to something so easily. I think that especially because of my experience on the Bobolink Roundtable and how long and how complicated it is, how long we've thought about the issues around land practices and what land practices are best, and really dealing with a lot of questions that we don't have answers to. Safe Harbour agreements are very carefully crafted documents that set out, and these are the ones in the States, they set out the responsibilities of each party, a description of the baseline conditions, an inventory of the species present, a description of the species targeted and their habitat needs, a description of the stewardship actions that will be undertaken, requirements regarding notification if there's going to be harm to the species, the nature of the expected incidental take, and terms for monitoring assessment. These are fairly complex documents. And when you have an agreement, it means that these things are understood and they're agreed to. People know what they're getting into. It means that the agreements are site-specific and they're species-specific. Again, the details are taken care of. And for me, an agreement between the government and between the parties involved means that there's clarity. There's clarity and there's certainty for species at risk. And that's the kind of reassurance that I would like to see when I see Safe Harbour goes forward. And there's a reason for wanting some reassurance, and because I think we need to remember that Safe Harbour is about allowing landowners to violate the prohibitions. It's about allowing people to harm an endangered species in its habitat. It's for a very good purpose, and I'm fully behind it. But there's a risk. Time? There's a risk. I mean, there's a potential for abuse, but I think there's a much larger potential for screw-ups because people just don't have the experience and the expertise necessary to be doing things like this without the guidance that you would get if you had to negotiate agreement with government and so on. So, do I want landowners tied up in knots with legal agreements and red tape? No, I do not. I think there's ways around this, and we've discussed them at the roundtable, and I've discussed them with M&R. First of all, in the States, there's something called an umbrella agreement, and that means that there are organizations that work with a bunch of landowners, and the actual legal agreement is between that organization and the government itself. And then all those other landowners are covered under that agreement. So if you had, for example, a land trust or a farm organization or a conservation organization that worked with a bunch of landowners, they could enter into that legal agreement with government, and then when it came to the individual landowners, it wouldn't be so complicated, and that organization could take care of things, and you wouldn't have landowners buried in red tape. The other option is to develop a template agreement. If you have a template, you've got the basic things in place, and you can add in the details that you need around the species and the site, the things that are specific. There are ways to keep things simple, and I think we need to keep things simple. But I also think we need to keep things really safe. Safe Harbour is a great idea. We need to do it. I can't wait till we get on with it, but I really, really hope that we do so in a way that is going to ensure a good outcome for species at risk. Thanks for listening.